Since I didn't prepare anything in regards to our presenter's biography, I just went to the Facebook event that they all created. So just a little biography of Adam Newman. Adam Newman is a film critic for The Grid and CinemaScope in Toronto. He has contributed articles to Globe and Mail, The National Post, The Village Voice, and The Wireless. He's a programmer for the Toronto Jewish Film Festival, Jewish Film Society, and has his MA in Cinema Studies from the University of Toronto. So we'll have about 15 minutes for the presentation, and then we can go to the question and answers.
And he also only dresses like this because he was just playing baseball. It's a Saturday night. I should look better than I do, but I apologize. Thank you very much for having me back. I had a really wonderful time the last time talking about Unforgiven. I think it's absolutely great that people are getting together on a Saturday, watching a serious movie and talking about it. I don't get this kind of good conversation even with my other friends who talk about films. They're all too bored and they just want to go drink. This is great to actually sit and talk about a substantial movie. And I think that this is a very, very substantial film. You might have thought when you saw it on the list, I know you guys are doing art cinema now, right? Is that the idea? International
contemporary art.
Yeah. So this one might have seemed, if you were reading about it in the list with the other films, that this one might be a little lighter, or this one might be fun, or more of a genre film, more of a detective film. But as you guys have all mentioned in your comments, it's much more sophisticated and more substantial than that. I want to talk about three things very quickly, and then I want to hear more from you guys, and you can ask some questions. I want to talk about what's happened in South Korean cinema in the last 10, 15 years. And this movie is a big part of that. I want to talk about this director, Bong Joon-ho, because I think he's a great contemporary filmmaker, and you should have some sense of his other work. And then I want to talk about Memories of Murder. A lot of the things I want to talk about are things that you've already said. So, around the time that this film is set, 1986, 1987, if you had said, oh, I saw a really good South Korean movie the other night, you would have been lying. Because there was not a lot of good cinema being made in Korea in the 1970s, not a lot of good cinema being made in Korea in the 1980s. And part of that is because of the very military dictatorship that the movie takes place after. It's a case in many countries, from Romania to South Korea, at certain times in the history of Iran, at certain times certainly in the history of South American countries like Argentina, that depending on who is in power, how much money the government needs to give people to make movies, and what censorship laws are, that sometimes countries have great new waves and great renaissances of movies, and sometimes nothing gets made. And I think a lot of the films that came out of South Korea in the 1980s were kind of official films. They were films about the far past of the country. Someone used the word, they were very smart, they said exotic. The idea that a lot of South Korean films are exotic. The reason they were exotic, the reason they were beautiful, the reason they were big was because they couldn't be about reality. No one was really making a movie about the way the country was in the 1970s and the 1980s. And this was a full-on military dictatorship. This was a general in the South Korean army basically came in, violently took power, elected himself the 5th president of the country, and kept power for 7 or 8 years. That's when the movie is taking place. But you would never have a movie like this about the 1980s made in the 1980s. So I hope that that point makes sense. That you could only make a movie like this about this time in South Korea and the effect of this regime years after the fact. And I don't know if you guys are seeing Romanian films in this class or if you're seeing Argentinian films in this class, but what those countries have in common, Romania, Argentina, and South Korea, is the very best films being made now, since about 2000, 2005, 2010, are all reactions to that period because the filmmakers grew up at that time. Bong Joon-ho, who made this film, he's a young guy. I've interviewed him 2 or 3 times. He's maybe 5 or 6 years older than I am. So in a way, this is a picture of his childhood. This is a picture of the society that he grew up in. And I think that some of the other South Korean directors who you might be familiar with, you mentioned I Saw the Devil by Kim Ji-woon. There's also a very famous director named Park Chan-wook who made Old Boy. I don't know if any of you saw that film, which is being remade by Spike Lee this year. Those directors are not as interested in history as Bong Joon-ho. Bong Joon-ho, as some of you very smartly said, He's seen Hollywood movies, he's playing with Hollywood genre. There's a reason his movies get seen internationally, because he has those genre movie elements, the detective movie elements. But what he's really doing here is making a movie about history. He's making a movie about the time he grew up. He's making a movie about the way that the country was in the 1980s. And I think he's making a movie about the effects of the 1980s on Korea now. Because even though this is a period piece, okay, it's a historical movie, 25 years ago this movie takes place, I think he's saying that those effects of living under a dictatorship, of living in a repressed society, of living in a place where violence is so normal, still matters to people living in South Korea now. So that's what I want to say about South Korean cinema, is it's in a big boom moment right now, but that's because politically it's more open. And that's because you have these directors who grew up in a different time, are now taking advantage of this freedom and making films that are very violent, that are very striking, that are very passionate, that are very sort of aggressive. And that's proving to be very popular. Now, quickly about Bong Joon-ho. This is his second film. His first film is called Barking Dogs Don't Bite. It's a romantic comedy. It's his weakest film. He didn't do very well with romance, and he did so-so with comedy, but it was not a great start to his career. This film is his second film. It's a great hit internationally. Got fantastic reviews. It was seen as being sort of a key film of the new South Korean cinema. I think it played at 50 festivals around the world. I saw it at TIFF when it came out, I think in 2006. I thought it was the best South Korean movie I'd seen in years. He has since made two films that if you like tonight's movie, I highly recommend that you rent. One is called The Host. Has anyone seen it? A couple people. It's hilarious. It's a monster movie set in Seoul. It's about a giant mutant fish that comes out of the Han River in Seoul and sort of terrorizes the population. It's like a Godzilla movie. But it's very funny. It's also very melancholy, and it's very political. Because the message of The Host is that they should have gotten rid of this fish when it was a small little thing. They let it get really big, it's out of control, and it almost destroys the society. So it's a simple metaphor, but it's a metaphor. Then he made a film 2 years ago called Mother, which I don't know if any of you have seen, which is a horror movie about a woman whose son is accused of being a killer in a small town, and she tries to clear his name. And a lot of that movie is very similar. The tone, the direction, and the technique is similar to Memories of Murder. So if you like this film, you should see his other movies. And if you like this film, you might really like Mother, which I think is not a sequel, but kind of a companion piece. So now we'll talk about Memories of Murder. And many of you have said things about it that I would say, and maybe I can elaborate on a couple of them. Someone asked how close this was to the true story, and it's very close. Between the years of 1986 and 1991, there were 3,000 suspects interrogated over 10 murders in a small town outside of Seoul. 3,000 people were brought in for questioning by 300,000 policemen. Okay? Some people think it was more than that. Depending on who you read, they think 1 million policemen were involved. This is over the deaths of 10 people. What does this say to you about South Korea in the mid-1980s? They were not prepared for something like this. And one of the things that you see in the film is that no one even knows what a serial killer is. It takes them about a while. I didn't watch the movie with you guys tonight, but I've seen it twice, so I'm remembering. I mean, for a while they don't believe that it would be the same person, because people in this society believe that nothing bad ever happens. The government takes care of everything, that everyone is behaving themselves, that everyone is nice and everyone is normal. But we see that this is not the case. Think about all of the aberrant and screwed up people who you see in this movie, none of whom are the killer, right? I mean, you have people who are mentally ill, you have people who are sexually perverted, you have people who are poor, you have people who are lonely, you have people who are confused. That's almost everyone you see. And the people who you see who are not mentally ill, the people who you see who are not poor, the people who you see who are not victims, are police officers who are confused, who are corrupt, who do not have the technology, do not have the schooling, do not have the ability to do their jobs properly. Think of that amazing scene, and it really is an amazing scene when he first comes to the crime scene. You remember it's all done in one shot. What's going on in that scene? All of the evidence is being screwed up. everything. They're walking over the crime scene, they're destroying fingerprints, they're moving things around, they're violating the integrity of the crime scene. They have the technology, they're starting to get the technology that you have in a country like America, the forensics to solve crimes. It's like CSI, but they don't know what they're doing. So you have a kind of aftermath of a military dictatorship where everyone is expecting an authority above them to fix everything, to solve everything, and to protect them. But it's actually the opposite. That these people have lived under this kind of authority and lived under this pressure for so long that they can't look after themselves, they can't protect themselves, they can't sort each other out. And 10 women who are killed, it's less in this film, I know, but in the reality, that's a drop in the bucket considering how violent the country is. When you have a history of police interrogation, when you have a history of political assassination, when you have a history of people sort of living and dying in poverty and living and dying in police custody, no wonder a serial killer slips through the cracks. And even though I agree with your comment that the ending of the film is not very believable, I mean, it's not realistic that this guy would go back and take a look at this and see this girl. At that point, the movie is moving into a kind of a poetic realm, or it's moving into a symbolic realm. What that scene means is not, as some critics thought, that he's the killer. That's not what that means at all. People shouldn't be confused. She's not looking at him and saying, oh, he looked like you, so you're the killer. What it's saying is that in this society, everyone looks the same to everybody else, and even the most horrible serial killer could pass unnoticed because they don't know how to look. And also, that if everyone in this city and if everyone in this country took a look at each other, they all have memories of violence, they all have memories of murder, and if he's a policeman, he participated in that. You see that he participated in great violence working as a police officer. His conscience is not clean. Now, some people were very frustrated with the movie. They said, well, why didn't they find the killer? Well, in real life, they didn't find the killer. So Bong Joon-ho would have been inventing a solution that never happened. But I also think that this movie is a lot like, has anyone seen Zodiac?
Yeah.
Which is an American film by David Fincher about the Zodiac killer in the 70s. They're almost the same movie. And I've interviewed Bong Joon-ho, and he's a great fan of Zodiac. He thinks it's one of the best movies he's ever seen. And I'm not surprised about that, because what both movies are about is that the more information you have, the more people you talk to, the more evidence you gather, you know less. And that just seems to be a fact in so much police work, whether it's in America in the 1970s or in South Korea in the 1980s. In both films, you have a society that doesn't know what a serial killer is. In Zodiac, there's no such thing as a serial killer in 1970. The Zodiac killer is brand new. The cops all say that in that movie. They say, we don't know what this is. South Korea in 1986, they don't know what this is. They want to figure it out. They obsess over it. They look for it. The more they look, the more obsessed they become, the less they see, because they're looking for an answer. They want to know, well, if we can just find one bad person who did this, we'll all be safe, it'll all be solved. But it's not that simple. Finding one guy who killed 5 or 6 women is not going to fix what's wrong with this culture. It's not going to fix what's wrong with this society. It's not going to fix all of the people who've been hurt and suffered who died over the previous 20 years. And so in this way, Memories of Murder is really quite a depressing movie. And it's made to be a depressing movie. It's made as a commentary on the time that it's set in the 1980s. And he also, I think, is saying that that same mindset, that same idea of looking for answers but not knowing how to find them is still going on now. And I would even say that the movie goes beyond being about South Korea. I think it's about certain sort of universal things. I think there's a lot of universal conflicts in this movie. People from the city resenting people from the country resenting people from the city. We have that in Ontario, you know, it's not just simply limited to South Korea. That idea of police corruption, that idea of torture, which many of you have brought up, absolutely Bong Joon-ho has said that this is a movie made after 9/11. And even though it has nothing to do with America, even though it has nothing to do with the Middle East, it's very much about that idea of forced compliance, forced confession, and how little good that often seems to do. But here's the thing about this movie that none of you have talked about, and the thing about Bong Joon-ho that I will bring up, and then maybe this can be in some of our discussion. The tone of this movie is all over the place. And some people don't like it for that reason, because the violence is sometimes very funny, or it thinks it's very funny, or you have to laugh at it because it's so absurd, like when he drop kicks the guy out of nowhere. I mean, that's a very silly scene. You're in the scene, the suspect is being beaten up, it's very intense, and then there's like a jump kick, like it's a wrestling move. And for some people watching that, they can't be okay with it. And in The Host, and in Mother, and in some of his other movies, this is a constant of his cinema. Things are very funny, and then things are very scary, and then things are very serious, and then things are very absurd again. And the criticism that this movie got when it came out was that you can't be all of those things at the same time. That if you're going to make a serious movie about corruption, if you're going to make a serious movie about society, you can't have that kind of violence. And if you're going to make a comedy, then it shouldn't be so depressing and it shouldn't be so heavy. Now, I personally love that mix of tones. I think that mix of tones is really impressive. Mm-hmm. I think he does it really well. I think that he knows how to shoot things so that they can be serious and very intense. And I think he knows how to shoot things with the camera so that they're kind of funny, like cartoon gags. But that's me. That's my opinion as a critic. It's something actually that I like about him a lot. But I wonder as we move into the Q&A if that's something that occurred to any of you or something that bothered any of you. Because what I think makes him such a unique filmmaker is a seriousness of purpose, but a very, very commercial sensibility. He knows what's going to sell. He knows that genre movies sell. He knows that murder sells, serial killer sells, and this movie got seen all around the world. And one of the reasons it got seen all around the world is because of its title and because of what it's about. And so, as much as I can sit and say that it's a serious movie about this crime that happened in South Korea, and it's about the dictatorship, and it's about society, other people say, well, he's exploiting it. He's exploiting it. He's taking something very sad and very terrible that happened, and he's making a kind of genre movie out of it, making a kind of detective movie about it, making a piece of entertainment about it. And for every critic you find who thinks this is a great film, there are other people who find it very irresponsible and who sort of think that he's a very sort of ironic and sort of congratulating filmmaker, and that all of the style, that all of the atmosphere, and that all of the dread is a bad thing because he's making popcorn art, pop cinema out of real death and real murder. That's something that I think happens a lot in cinema. It happens a lot in American cinema. It happens a lot around the world. But because he's so successful coming out of Korea, the conversation in Korea kind of happens around him. So I hope I've made it clear that I think he's a very valid film artist. I think he's a great filmmaker, and he's still young. I mean, he's only made 4 movies. But maybe this question of style, this question of tone, which none of you brought up before, is something you can think about. But if you guys have any other questions about the style of the film, the background of the film, the actors in the film, his direction, I can answer them because I've written a lot about this guy's work, and hopefully I can answer your questions. So okay. I'm going to stop now.
Yeah, thank you. So you can be seated there in about like 15-20 minutes. So
yeah.
We can go with the question and answer, and then later on we can go to discussions and
sure.
You can join us, or you can join us from there as well. Anybody wants to ask a question, if you can just raise your hand maybe, and then we'll have the questions for as long as almost, I would say, 20 minutes, maybe until 9:30. Sirius?
Don't you think the tone of the